So Joel Embiid just scored 70 points in a single game wearing the Embiid 1, a shoe that's been around for a little while and doesn't get talked about all that much. The other thing is, he also got 18 rebounds, and as we know, getting rebounds in the NBA sometimes requires a lot of foot-to-foot combat. And so let's take a look inside the shoes that he was wearing when he was, yeah, absolutely dominating. Now, you know, the uppers, the Embiid 1, if you can clip this thing in. The uppers, the Embiid 1, are really not what they seem when we look at them online. They're just, I think the word I could describe them most as is cavernous. The tongue of them, a ton of meshing, but very, very breathable. The forefoot of the shoe, a ton of meshing, but then a really hard backer underneath of it. If you look at the breathability test on these things, number one, there was no fog getting out of that forefoot whatsoever. However, on the breathability test on these, they only heated up 120.6 degrees, and for a shoe with this profile, honestly, it's probably a lot of home cooking from the tongue because that tongue is just so porous, it is so breathable. So, you know, the one thing is they didn't let go of heat all that well. So my thing is, yes, it's going to expel a lot of heat out of the tongue, but it's going to probably hold on to some moisture in and around the ankle collar and into the forefoot of the shoe, just because they are so darn substantial of a shoe. If you look at the other parts, the uppers, you get that TPU wing that goes right on your fifth metatarsal head, which does really help with pivoting, especially, which I'll talk about a little bit, outdoors in a wet condition like this, just is really a nice asset to have. The heel slippage on these things is just about none because of that quasi-mid nature of these. So in terms of the uppers, it's mostly just an optical illusion. When you look at them from afar, they don't look like much. When you have them on foot, they're like armored tanks made of textile mesh. The one thing though that is not an armored tank about that mesh is its abrasion resistance. On the upper durability test, 10 seconds highest grit sandpaper, yeah, I mean, the burr just starts to rip right through this. Now, it is such a thick piece of material that, I mean, it's gonna do all right over time, but if you're gonna be using these on outdoor courts and you are a slider or dragger, get ready for the uppers to look a little bit beat up. One thing though that I really underappreciated about these shoes until I started taking the laces out was just how containing the lace line is in and of itself. This thing is so reinforced, it's crazy. Number one, you've got the reinforcing elements with the foxing piece here on the lateral side with this winglet, as well as on the medial side with this little synthetic leather winglet. But even though those reinforce the lace line, the laces go through this and then into the shoe right underneath of there, into the body of the upper. That is also reinforced with waxing underneath both of these wings. And then it crosses back over the traditional lace line going up the shoe. What that does though is when you tie the laces down around your midfoot, the tension across that lace line and the force you're applying to those laces is being distributed all the way from the far medial side of the shoe up and over to the far lateral side of the shoe. And because it's reinforced both on top and underneath, you can crank down on these laces and it's not going to destroy the uppers. That gives this shoe such outsized containment, especially for somebody like Embiid, who's 7 foot tall, what is it, 300 pounds almost? You know, someone like him who's number one, a big, but number two, has just a little bit more foot skills than some other people in his position, a little bit more agile. So this shoe is gonna give him just that little bit more containment. And you can just see what you can do to a shoe and how containing you can make a shoe just by giving a little bit of thought to where you're putting your lace holes. The midsole setup on the teardown is another place you can really see Embiid's stamp on this shoe. It is an entire bed of micro G foam, which is rubberized EVA. Thing is, if you look at it on the microscope, it's a lot more chunky and haphazard versus some other rubberized EVAs we see on the microscope, which are very uniform. They have, you know, nice little cratering in them, just very uniform, almost like a golf ball. That's what they look like, right? The surface of a golf ball. This looks like the surface of Mars on the microscope. It's very chunky, that foam going all which ways. I think it's meant just to be a little bit more rugged, to give a little bit better push off from really any position you are in. I think that's at least the design theory anyway. Then you've got this slab of hover foam here in the heel, which is an olefin copolymer, which is similar to flow foam, except in its, you know, just performance kind of characteristics. Because if you look at this setup on the bounce height test, got 27 centimeters in the heel and then 30 in the forefoot. You know, flow foam, when you put it on the bounce height test, the ball is bouncing to the moon. So definitely a little bit more of a dense setup here on the hover foam. To me, this shoe is much more of a bottom stable shoe versus a real springy shoe. If you look at the shank, that shank score got a 0.3, which is pretty high. The presence of a shank, it's top loaded, and this thing is double thickness. This thing is big. This is meant to handle a big in this shoe for sure. And remember, with all these foams, you can dial in the density of these. You can kind of really dial in the properties. And I think in this one, to me, the shoe underfoot, like I said, this foam was very stable. Did feel a little bit stiff on there. That break-in profile is very nice on a foam like Micro G, so it's gonna get a little bit better over time. And when we talk about the rubber in this, we'll talk about how that sweet spot might last a little bit longer, especially for the foams in this. But at least to me, this setup is basically meant for stability as well as forgiveness in that hover foam in the heel, much more meant for a crash landing versus something like in the Curry line, which is meant for being a springboard. All right, but let's talk about the outsole tread in these, and ironically why I'm on a slick, cold, outdoor painted court. The indoor hardwood courts this week that I go to, just really crowded, didn't feel comfortable filming in front of all these people that, you know, didn't ask to be filmed. I did notice though, just ironically being out here, how well these grip, even super slick, cold painted courts. And that's just because of how rugged the traction is. This is a topographical mat pattern, which, you know, we see on, you know, a few shoes here and there. It's just that typically those linear patterns, those lines are really thin and narrow and really only want to interact with something like a hardwood or rubberized court. These ones are super chunky and thick, so they will grab into a really slick painted court and give really outsized confidence on something like this. Now on indoor hardwood, they definitely go through a break-in phase. They're a little bit stiff to begin with. They're not bad by any means, but they are a little bit more forgiving. On the grip test ramp, they slid at 38 degrees, which is on the lower end of that mid-range of shoes. That's like medium tack. Now, once these break in, once you kind of go through that little bit of a graining phase, or once you heat them up, yes, then they become a lot more grippy on those indoor courts. And if you're somebody like Embiid, who puts a ton of force down on his shoes and really just needs something for more, I would say, just bottom stable feeling grip, then I think these are really a perfect match, because the rubber on these is a little bit heavier. You definitely feel more bottom heavy, bottom stable on these, which differs more from the UA Curry Flow line, which is a lot more bottom light and springy, right, for his style of play, especially if you look at the outsole durability test, 10 seconds highest grit sandpaper. I mean, the durometer is pretty high on these. They didn't get a millimeter of damage, and just even forget about the durability test for a second, just the thickness of the rubber and just how much of it there is. The break-in phase on these is gonna be so long. So once you break them in, you're gonna have that sweet spot in these a little bit longer than some others, because the tread is just so thick. There's just so much of it that you can utilize, versus some other shoes where you break the rubber in and then that millimeter and a half of tread depth just goes away after a while. So that really buttery phase, that really sweet spot phase, isn't that long in these ones. Once you put the work in to break that rubber in, they're gonna reward you with a little bit more longevity in that sweet spot phase than some others. And although that's all well and good about the stock tread on the Embiid one and what is designed for, especially for him, when you are Joel Embiid and you can get pretty much whatever you want, he has changed his outsole rubber and outsole tread, I should say, a few times. He does play in the topographical mat pattern. He also has a pretty flat herringbone pattern with some circular pivot points that he puts on some of his shoes, as well as it seems like he's played with a Flowtro component to his shoes as well. So it probably just depends what he's feeling like at the time, or kind of what he needs underfoot at that time. Like I said, when I was outside, these do best once they are broken in a little bit and you've worn them for a while, whereas with Embiid, if you're getting as many of them as you want, you don't necessarily need that break-in profile. You can go get something that might be a little bit more buttery, just a little bit, have a little more feel right out of the box, so that you can keep wearing a newer pair of shoes. So, and honestly, I think it just depends at the time what he's feeling. You know, sometimes he might want the more rugged tread of this. Other times he might want the easy step in of maybe some of the other rubbers or foams in the Curry or Under Armour line. But there's always a but, or on this channel, there's always a however, I guess. If you look at the speed ratio of these, only comes in at a 1.73, shank score of 0.3 brings it up to a 2.03. I think that's really where these belong. to be really bottom stable, more bottom heavy of a shoe. It's not going to have the crazy launch of some others. It's not going to be a speedy shoe like some others. And if you're Embiid, do you really need it, right? Like, he's bringing all of it to the table himself. Someone like me, I gravitate much more to the Curry line of shoes. Makes my frame, which is not that of a professional athlete, feel a lot more lively, whereas this is much more meant to contain all the liveliness and just all of the absolute craziness that he can bring to his footwork and to an NBA court. And when looking at the width of the Embiid one, it fits pretty standard in terms of length and width, 9 centimeters across for my size, 11 at the metatarsal areas. And like I've said before, if you do want to compare all the lengths and widths with the measurements you see on here in one sheet, you know, from widest to narrowest, you can purchase access to that Google Sheet in the description below over on footdoctorzach.com. I will leave that linked down below. You can sort by pretty much any stat I do on this channel, so you can check that out below. But I will just say, in terms of width, remember this stabilizing piece here and this reinforced on the lace line, remember, like I said, the laces go underneath of that. So if you are somebody with a tailor's bunion or prominent styloid, this shoe just might be a mismatch for you. A narrow and medium foot, I think just go true to size. A 2E, I think you can go up just half size. You should be okay in these in terms of break-in. Like I said, unless you are wide over by your 5th metatarsal head and base. At that point, even a 4E going up one size, you might still have issues. So you might just be a mismatch there. In terms of the snake bitten foot, there's so much density of foam in the heel that it is going to be a very outstanding shock absorber for things like plantar fasciitis, Achilles tendonitis, bursitis, things like that. And with an orthotic, I think it brings it up more into that, you know, good for territory in terms of arch pain, arch strain. That shank is so nice, broad and thick. I think that it really does hold up an orthotic very nicely and does well on its own. So really, it's a better rear foot shoe than a forefoot shoe, but because of the density of the foam in there and how it locks you down, good for orthotics and braces as well. And you know, when talking about the marriage between, you know, Joel Embiid as well as the Embiid 1, I do think these are a really nice matchup for him. The amount of stability you get in this shoe, while it not being overly encumbering, right? Like, it doesn't smack you in the face like some really maximalist shoes do. This one, like I said, does have a little bit more of a buttery feeling once you break it in, especially in the uppers. These things will move and sway with you while having a very, very stable base. So somebody like him that, you know, sometimes you kind of see him gliding through the air, especially on his way to the rim or when he's kind of getting out of the way of other people. He can contort his lower body in ways that people that play his position normally can't. And so I think the uppers of these really do a nice job of that. They have reinforcement where you would need it, right? Just to, you know, to be able to grab some stability on the lateral side. But they're also, like I said, buttery enough that, you know, he can move around and he can extract the tools of his own feet with these shoes. I think you put him in something that might be a little bit more encumbering on him, and I don't know if he can get the range of motion or the degrees of freedom that he needs to kind of make the shots that he does and get the space that he can get, all while having enough stability under his foot for him to, if he needs to, just bully his way to the hoop, right? Just, you know, dominate his way through a lane, or go up and down, up and down, up and down and get rebounds, right? And crash down and down and down on this ridiculously dense stack of foam. Remember, it's not just getting up into the air, it's what happens when you come back down. And doing that over and over and over again, that's what produces injuries, right? And something like this, as well as like the AG4 from 361, it's those type of shoes that have that protection when you come back down so that you can go back up and do it again. That's the real trick, right, in making a shoe that is good for rebounding and a shoe that is good for jumping, right? It's being able to preserve your feet and lower leg and back so you can keep doing it over and over again. But I'd love to know if you're trying to pick up a pair of, you know, the Embiid 1. They are relatively inexpensive. I got mine on Amazon, I think $89. I know they're on eBay too. I'll leave some links down below if you want to check them out. But I guess he's signing with Skechers, but he's still playing with a PE of these. So which is it? Are you waiting for the Skechers Embiid 1 or Embiid 2, or whatever they're gonna call it, or are you gonna try to pick up a pair of these on sale? Let me know in the comments down below. And if you wanna see the other cousin to the Embiid 1 going to the knife, the Curry Spawn Flotro, make sure you click into this video up above and subscribe down below. Respect your rubber and foam, especially the foam that looks like the surface of Mars on a microscope. I'll see you somewhere in the Sneakerverse.